part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole. First of all, happy Women's History Month. For our first episode this month, we wanted to find a period drama set in Ireland because it is Maggie's birthday month, which happens to fall on St. Patrick's Day. So happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone, and happy birthday to Maggie.
Thank you. But my birthday is not the only thing we're celebrating this month. Petticoats and Poppies just celebrated its 1 year anniversary, which is surreal. So thank you so much to our listeners, old and new, who have stuck it out with us. And thank you, as always, to Earglue Media and to our lovely editor and producer, Albert.
I cannot believe it's been a year.
It is. I will let the listeners know that we are recording on the eve of my birthday, and it is very strange to consider that we had just started quarantine a year ago and we are still in it. It's very strange. And to think about the fact that this podcast has just kind of like been a place for you and I to enjoy movies, even though movie theaters aren't much of a thing right now.
Yeah, it's very weird to think this podcast and the pandemic actually have like the exact same lifespan, at least the pandemic within the United States, which is, it's a very weird thing to sort of wrap my head around because in some ways this podcast still feels so new. And yet I feel like I've been in quarantine for like my entire life at this point.
It's weird to be like doing something amidst history, especially when we're talking about history.
Oh, absolutely.
But, today we are talking about the 2011 film Albert Nobbs. It is a British and Irish film directed by Rodrigo Garcia. The screenplay is written by Glenn Close, John Banville, and Gabriella Prekop, and it is based on the 1927 novella by George Moore. Now, it also stars Glenn Close, Janet McTeer, Mia Wasikowska. I always say her name wrong.
I think you said it beautifully. I always have to pause before I attempt her name, so.
I just was like, I'm going to plow through this and hope for the best. And then Aaron Taylor Johnson, Jonathan Rhys Meyers, Brendan Gleeson, and Maria Doyle Kennedy.
And it's Aaron Taylor Johnson back when he was just Aaron Johnson.
Just Aaron Johnson.
Which is,
I know, which is
which
weird.
is so weird.
The Oscar nominations were for Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, Best Makeup. Close also starred in a play adaptation of the novella Off-Broadway in 1982 and had been passionately trying to get a film of this made. It was her passion project. I have a lot of questions. And it is set in the 19th century, so it's right up our alley.
So, first of all, I want to say we need more period dramas set in Ireland.
Please.
This one doesn't feel very Irish to me, partially because of the bad accents happening.
So many bad accents.
Particularly Glenn's is bad. But also, I want to say to everyone listening that we chose this film knowing very little about it. We were like, let's find something set in Ireland. We were like, oh, this takes place in Dublin. Let's do it. And did not realize what we were getting ourselves into. I watched it first, and I was like, oh, Maggie, we may have bitten off more than we can chew. I can't believe I'd never heard of this movie before. I would have been in high school whenever it came out. But
I was a freshman in college.
Yeah, it completely was not on my radar. This cast is incredible. Like, the people in this movie, I mean, Aaron Taylor Johnson looking maybe the hottest he has ever looked. Like, wow. Wow.
Wow, indeed.
Emerald Fennell and Phoebe Waller-Bridge are in tiny roles in this. Which, especially now that I can say, like, Oscar-nominated writer and director Emerald Fennell feels very weird to me to see her in this movie. I'm gonna come right out and say I don't think Glenn Close is good in this film at all. I think it might be her
So
worst performance. And Janet McTeer is acting circles around her.
Shocking, truly.
Yeah. And
I mean, Janet's great, but like Glenn Close.
I love Janet McTeer. I love her like a lot. Also, now that I'm thinking about it, Glenn Close was in the movie of Dangerous Liaisons, right?
Yes.
Wasn't it Janet McTeer who was in the Donmar Warehouse production playing the same role?
I think so.
It's the filmed National Theater Live one. Yeah.
I think you're right.
So, Janet McTeer supremacy. We love a Donmar Warehouse alum. But this is such a blatantly Oscar bait film. Like, one of those films where we're like, we get it, Glenn, you want an Oscar. The fact that this is her passion project is so confusing to me. So confusing. I mean, I'm glad she got it out of her system, I guess, but like, did we need to subject the whole world to this movie? The script is not good. The story it's telling is muddled at best. There's just a lack of direction in the storytelling. And like half of the characters don't even make sense. Like there's an entire plotline, the whole plotline with the maid and Aaron Taylor Johnson's character.
I can't even remember what his character's name is.
I literally was just like, I don't know what anyone in this movie is named other than Albert Nobbs. And I didn't watch this that long ago. But like that entire plotline,
I watched it on Saturday and I can't remember.
I also want to say, like, we are obviously not experts on discussing trans narratives. Like, neither of us are trans. We're both cisgender. So I'm not going to claim in any way, shape, or form to be an expert on that. It does feel to me that this is a weird story in that it never really takes a stance on whether this is the story of a trans man or whether this is the story of a woman posing as a man to sort of get by in a man's world, sort of like Mulan is a story of a woman posing as a man. There's never any ambiguity there about her gender identity. It's only about, her presenting differently than her identity to be able to accomplish something. I feel like this toes a really weird line. And I also feel like it doesn't really unpack the experience of someone who was trans, or even honestly, I don't think it fully unpacks the experience of someone pretending to be a gender other than their own, other than the one that they identify with, in Victorian Ireland. Like, I don't really think it accomplishes anything here in terms of portraying something meaningful, in terms of gender identity. And from everything that I found, I was scouring Letterboxd and different reviews, it feels like that's also the opinion of trans critics who have written about this movie. And just a last note before I shut up and let Maggie talk is, why do so many movies about people who are queer or non-conforming, part of the LGBT plus community in some way, why do they almost always end in tragedy?
It is the weirdest
I think that
thing.
And listen, there are times where I think that's appropriate in a film, mainly if you're telling a true story. Like, obviously, you can't make a film about Oscar Wilde that doesn't have a tragic aspect. But
the happy life of Oscar Wilde.
Right. But I think that we as a society have moved past the need for sad, tragic films that are entirely fictional about LGBT plus characters.
I entirely agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. While I was watching this film, I checked out pretty early on. I think I made it to about the 20-minute mark, and then I was like, what is this film? So I started doing research because that's typically what I start doing when a film is mind-numbingly bad. And I started to like research the climate about 10 years ago when this film came out. And I found a HuffPost piece, which let's pour one out for all of the HuffPost reporters who were fired this month by BuzzFeed. Definitely stung to recognize a few pieces that were written by people who have now lost their jobs. But there was a really great piece that I read that was reviewing the film and was discussing, you know, the transphobia that was happening in 2011, which is still obviously happening today. But I want to believe that it's getting a little bit better in terms of how people are reacting to films that are about that experience. But the article goes into some details about a number of reviews that were referring to Albert as creepy because of the experience that that character was living, and then was also saying like entirely unrelatable, was referring to Albert as an it rather than a him, which we do at least know that the character goes by him. And then like was referring to the film as disturbing and sad. And it was just like very obvious that this is a conversation that needs to be had. And doesn't seem like that conversation was ever fully had in 2011, which is just, you know, tragic. And, you know, I agree with Nicole, what you were saying about how this film, it feels more like it's about women trying to exist within a man's world, but then it's never really clear about the intentions. Mm-hmm. And that's solely within the fault of the script. I feel like the script goes to great lengths to make it very unclear. I mean, there is that one moment where, I think it's Janet's character who asks Albert what their name was before, and just says Albert, which I think tries to make that line, but it's so
but at the same
cloaked
time,
in confusion.
There's a scene where the two of them go out wearing dresses and are like overjoyed at like expressing, I guess, this femininity. And so that's why I was so like, I literally
confused.
thought that I was like, oh, okay, this actually is about like a trans character. And then that scene occurred and I was like...
And then it like walked it back.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, now I'm just confused again.
It was so confusing. And then, you know, I found some more recent articles from Glenn Close that was talking about that controversy back in 2018 when Scarlett Johansson was cast to play a trans character. And Glenn Close said, like, my thinking right now is that people who are producing and directing properties like that need to go out of their way to actually get trans actors for the jobs. And I think that there has been some reflection on her part about the role of Albert and how it was perhaps damaging because it wasn't a good portrayal at all, if that was the intention of the film. But everything is still very much like cloaked in ambiguity. And, you know, it was weird. And I had a lot of issues with just how that was presented, you know, with so much of this conversation recently in, you know, social media and in the news. This film just have so many questions. And I'm still curious to know if it could have been made better now, where there is a lot more thought and care put into those roles, because even still, I mean, Scarlett Johansson was just in 2018. Like, they still haven't learned their lesson. But it's, you know, it's weird.
I do think that, like, one of the other things that really bothers me about this film is that, you know, obviously in this time period, there would have been a lot of confusion and ambiguity, I guess, around someone who was struggling in any way with their gender identity. That, you know, is something that's much more, I think, in the mainstream now, even as many, obviously, issues as there still are around it and with people accepting it. It was much less talked about back then. But the thing that I guess gets to me is, if the film doesn't have a clear stance, if it doesn't have a clear something that it wants to say about this, then why does it exist? And
what is the purpose?
The only answer is because the Oscars like transformative roles.
I couldn't figure out exactly what the purpose of this film was. I genuinely don't know what the elevator pitch could have been for this, other than Glenn Close has been wanting to do this since the 80s. Let's let her have it.
Let's help get her Oscar. And then she didn't get it, so...
No.
Hey, she's got another shot this year. Another
Good
transformative performance, you know? Yeah.
But this film just, outside of having a truly spectacular cast, was just a absolute hot mess.
Yep.
And I would love to pick Glenn Close's mind as to what she was doing with this character, because there were so many moments that I just could not figure out. Like, her movements were so strange. Wooden and, like, awkward. And I couldn't figure out if it was, like, a deliberate choice for how she was trying to portray this character, or if it was she didn't know what she was doing.
I've got to say, I think that, you know, with the way that the character is described, is it's someone who experienced sexual assault, and then decided to present as a man. That's a whole other thing to unpack.
Conversation
that idea
that was not unpacked,
which I think is part of why, to me, it almost feels less harmful to view this as a story about a woman who is posing as a man. Because otherwise, I think the narrative around the decision to do this becomes even more harmful if you want to view Albert
100%.
Yeah. But in any case, I just can't figure out, like, what the intention was here, because obviously, like, what we know of the character is that, like, they are very purposely trying to come off as masculine. But Glenn Close just comes off as, like, not human.
Yes.
Whereas, like, I think Janet McTeer does a much better job with what they're going for.
An absolute brilliant job.
Yeah.
I felt like a lot of Close's choices too felt like she forgot that she wasn't on the stage anymore.
Yes. Some
of it was really big, like the scene when she has to share the room with Janet's character. When Close is cowering in the corner, and it's very big, and I couldn't figure out. I was like, okay, I'm done. That was about where I checked out.
It's one of those things where, like,
she's such a good actor.
Yeah, she's a talented actor, but you would never guess that from her performance in this movie.
Which is just so disappointing.
But so, as, you know, part of this episode that we got ourselves into, and then it was the kind of thing where once we watched the film, it was like, well, we have to do the episode now because, you know, we sat through that movie for something. And honestly, I plan on saying this in my tweets about it and stuff, but for anyone who is listening to this and hasn't seen the movie, don't bother. Like, don't bother watching it. We've told you what you need to know. But I wanted to use this as a opportunity to take a look at, you know, some experiences that the film sort of tries to touch on. So I did some research. I am not a, you know, gender historian. I don't know all of this in great detail, but from what I could find, this is what I got. It's actually really sort of difficult to find information about these kind of topics in the Victorian era. Partially because I think things like non-cisgender identity would have been hidden. It wouldn't have been talked about openly for the most part. So that obviously makes research a little bit difficult. It's also there's a lot of lack of clarity around the trans experience in Victorian Britain, which, you know, I guess we do see that in the movie. About, you know, whenever we look at figures about whether they were trans people or whether they were women dressing as men to obtain jobs. That's something that you see. There's a couple of cases, like in the United States, that I've learned about, of women who dressed as men to be able to fight in the Civil War. There's a handful of cases of that. So it's a really complicated topic, don't you think, Maggie? I feel like I'm like struggling to express it, but
yeah.
The first use of the term trans appears in 1910. So in the 1880s, so Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis are starting to come up with this idea that sexuality is tied to identity, and that different people can have different sexualities. And so I think that sort of does start setting the ground for the idea of gender identity.
Mhm.
But the Criminal Law Act in 1888 makes trans people more susceptible to prison time. I didn't go fully into researching this, but my understanding is that it has something to do with the gross indecency clause of it. And that clause in this act is the one that will later be used against both Oscar Wilde and then later Alan Turing. So it is one that is incredibly harmful to LGBT plus people in Britain for many decades. There were certainly examples of people like Albert Nobbs in the movie who presented as a gender other than, their birth one during their lifetime. Often people were outed when they were arrested for unrelated crimes. I came across several examples of that. For example, Colonel Victor Barker, whose birth name was Valerie Arkell Smith, lived as a man throughout the 1920s. He even married a woman in 1923. But in 1929, he was arrested for contempt of court after not paying debts, and he was outed during his time at Brixton Prison. So a lot of the times that we do know something about someone like this, it's sort of through the eyes of them having been outed while they were in prison. So that also sort of complicates these narratives. But
Mhm.
a little bit later, I'm going to talk about Dr. James Barry, who is sort of one of the most accepted trans figures, I think, from this sort of time period. And there's still a lot of scholarly debate around things like this. I think it's one of those things that just is sort of impossible to know. Like whenever we talk about sexuality with historical figures, and that they didn't have the language that we have now to describe things, and often they didn't view sexuality in the ways that we do as a modern society. So it's sort of hard to go back and apply terms to historical
Mhm.
figures. But, you know, there are ways to do it that are better than this movie. I'll tell you that.
So many ways better. So kind of going off that, I thought that it would be interesting to talk about women who chose to present themselves as men to succeed and to go further with their aspirations throughout history. With the gender dynamics between men and women, it should really come as no surprise that there are countless numbers of instances of this, both reported and not, of women donning these male personas and trying to take advantage of things that otherwise would not have been afforded to them because they were born a woman. And so I had initially wanted to touch on 5 different notable women who had masqueraded as men throughout history. But I ended up just paring it down to 2 because I thought 5, I'd be here all night if I did 5. But if you want to learn more about some other figures that I won't be discussing, there are 2 British soldiers, Hannah Snell, who went by James Gray, and then Dorothy Lawrence, who went by Dennis Smith. And then, of course, you might be familiar with the situations where female authors oftentimes had to go as a male pseudonym in order to get published. And of course, a notable example of this would be George Eliot, who was Mary Ann Evans. And then, of course, the Bronte sisters are another set of notable women who had male personas during their lifetime. But I did want to touch on these 2 specific women, Sarah Emma Edmonds, who went by Franklin Thompson. Sarah was born in Canada in 1841. Her father treated her very poorly and resented the fact that he had a daughter instead of a son, which is oftentimes a very common thread in some of these origin stories for why these women chose to kind of don this male persona. She ended up changing her surname from Edmondson to Edmonds in order to escape her father's abuse and an arranged marriage. In order to travel undetected and secure a job so that she had a livelihood, she decided to disguise herself as a man, and she took on the name Franklin Thompson. She ended up coming down to America and joining the American Civil War as a Union soldier. She worked as a hospital attendant during her time in the war, and her memoirs also detail some exploits behind enemy lines throughout the war, where disguised as various different male personas, as well as an Irish peddler. She makes some claims about doing spy work, though it's never officially been confirmed that she was a spy. In the spring of 1863, she contracted malaria, and out of fear of being caught by her fellow soldiers, she fled, and her male persona was charged with desertion. She ended up marrying in 1867 and having 3 kids with her husband, and in 1897, she was admitted into the Grand Army of the Republic as the only woman member, and then a year later, she died. There are a lot of instances of this throughout numerous different wars. So definitely, if you're interested in that, research that. There are a lot of articles about Sarah and also some excerpts from her diaries. And then another notable woman is one of my favorites, a huge enthusiast of piracy. And Mary Read is probably my most favorite instance of this. She was born in 1695 and is one of only 2 known female pirates. Most of this information about her comes from the 1724 book published by Captain Charles Johnson. So Mary Read's mother was married to a soldier with whom she had a son. After that, the man deserted the family, and she had an affair, which resulted in the birth of Mary. So the story goes that this half-brother of hers, this older half-brother, died, and the father's family was like trying to give them like the inheritance money. And so if the boy was dead, Mary's mother wouldn't receive this inheritance money. So she passed off Mary as her dead brother. And she went by the name of Mark Read. And she went by this persona of being Mark up until like her teenage years, which I have no idea like how that was for her, because there's no first person accounts for this. But this like older relative didn't die until Mary was 13 years old and still dressing as a boy. It's a very strange situation. But it was during this time as a young teenager that she met another soldier, and she revealed like her true identity, and they ended up getting married, and then they opened this inn near Breda, Netherlands, and then her husband died, and she was kind of like completely out of luck again. And she went back to living as a man, and she eventually found work as a sailor. And then she took to the sea, and this was during the era of the golden age of piracy, which is a period that spanned from 1650 to the 1720s. And if you're up on your pirate lore, you will most likely recognize Mary Read as a pirate that goes to join Calico Jack's pirate ship alongside Anne Bonny, who was another woman who did not masquerade as a man, but she was another woman aboard the ship. They knew about each other's identities because Mary was still masquerading as Mark. Read and Bonny earned this like reputation for being like absolutely ruthless pirates. They're described as being very prolific at cursing and swearing much, and very ready and willing to do anything on board the ship, like very swashbuckling. I'm very into this. And then eventually Read and Bonny were caught and sentenced to death because piracy was a big crime. And interestingly, at the time of their sentencing, they were both pregnant, causing their executions to be postponed. But unfortunately, Read died in prison of a fever in April 1721. So it's very interesting to me, like how common this seems to have been, and how easy it would have been. I mean, There's so many instances. I was reading through a lot of different articles and some JSTOR kind of thesis papers I came across, and this was a very common occurrence, and it definitely seemed rooted in either childhood trauma about their father having wanted a son and ending up with a daughter, or their husband dying. And there are instances of women who like took on their dead husband's identities. Wow. And really it really just seems like, and some of those were harder to like prove because was it fraud? What were they actually living as their husbands, or were they just like signing the checks? Like, you know, lots of questions there, but it's really fascinating the links that women had to just to be respected throughout history. And some of these are going up into like the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
Like, yeah, some of the British soldiers, like, yeah, like after World War II, it was still a thing. Absolutely insane.
It's a really interesting topic. And obviously, you know, to talk about this, it's a sort of sensitive topic too, because you don't want to be dismissive of anyone. But at the same time, I think that, you know, there were lots of women who throughout time decided to pose as men purely to be able to do the things that they wanted to do, whether that was join the army or you know,
not lose their house.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it, you know, it sort of speaks to the limits put on women throughout history and the sort of extreme things that people were willing to do to try to get around them.
I feel like I probably would have done that if I was alive in these eras where being a woman was so oppressive.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially like Mary Read has always fascinated me since I was a child. That, you know, once her husband died, she's like, well, I'm not going back to life as a woman. I'm going to go become a sailor and journey over across the high seas. Unfortunately, she was still met with a pretty grim fate. Well, pregnant and in prison.
Oh, God, that does not. No thanks. Yeah. Well,
but we remember her name. That's something I always like. So many of these people, their names are remembered.
Absolutely. And one person whose name is definitely remembered that I wanted to really elaborate on, because they're, you know, as much as we don't know about Dr. James Barry, we know more about him than about a lot of these figures. So Dr. James Miranda Stewart Barry lived from 1789 to 1865. So a bit of an earlier period than this movie is set in, but not that far before. So he's best known for being a military surgeon in the British Army who was really dedicated to improving the care of wounded soldiers and the way that natives were treated in British colonies, and was the first European to perform a C-section in Africa and have both the mother and child survive, which occurred in 1826. So the thing about James Barry is that his life would be remarkable just in what he achieved as a doctor. So then when you add this layer onto it of, you know, the interesting history of his gender identity, I think it becomes even more remarkable. So Barry actually lived most of his life as a man, but he was born Margaret Ann Bulkley in Cork, Ireland. The Irish connection also made this feel like the right story to share on this podcast. Barry attended medical school at the University of Edinburgh, served in Cape Town, Africa, and then other parts of the empire, and rose to Inspector General of Military Hospitals, the second highest medical office in the British Army. Barry actually may have had a child as a teenager as a result of sexual violence, who was passed off as his younger sister, Juliana. Barry was actually educated to become a tutor, but then couldn't find a position. And so, with the help of his mother, who from this point onwards in his life posed as his aunt, and some friends of his late uncle, who was also named James Barry, who was an artist and a university professor, Margaret took on the identity of James and entered medical school, and would spend the next 56 years of his life as a man. And some people were suspicious of him whenever he showed up to medical school because of his high voice and his short height, but they just thought that he was younger than the age that a man was supposed to be to attend medical school. And with some help from one of his uncle's friends, he was eventually allowed to attend, and he graduated from medical school at the age of 22. So after graduating from medical school, Barry joins the army as a doctor, and while he's in Cape Town, he became close friends with the governor of Cape Town, Lieutenant General Lord Charles Henry Somerset, after treating his sick daughter, and he then becomes his personal physician as well. And that's a friendship that is going to be hugely influential to his life. It's Somerset who makes Barry the Colonel Medical Inspector in 1822, which is a huge jump in rank for him, and sort of propels him into this upwards trend of mobility within the British Army medical units. In Cape Town, Barry improves the water systems, sanitation, conditions for enslaved people and prisoners, and the mentally ill. He is, by our modern standards, incredibly progressive. Barry actually got into trouble later in his life with the army for returning to England without leave to treat Somerset at the end of his life in 1829. And he actually stays in England until Somerset's death in 1831. So they were incredibly close, and some people think that Somerset may have known the truth about Barry and the fact that he had been born a woman, and that was part of what tied them together, but there's no proof of that. So Barry famously argued with Florence Nightingale, and apparently was said to be very hard to get along with, had a really intense temper. He was even involved in a duel at one point, but he had an excellent bedside manner. Which is interesting. He was passionate about improving conditions for enslaved people, the mentally ill, even just, sort of the low-ranking common soldier wherever he went, and sometimes did that in a way that angered the officials, and he was even arrested a couple of times in trying to improve conditions for people. He loved pets. He had a poodle that he was very attached to, but he didn't have many friends. And some scholars think that's because it was easier to keep his, identity a secret if he sort of kept people at arm's length. He eventually died from dysentery. Not a fun end, but a less tragic end than a lot of these people. And you know what? A less tragic end than Albert Nobbs. So what we know, though, basically comes from the fact that a charwoman discovered his birth sex and stretch marks that seemed to be left from a pregnancy on his dead body. And she took it to, I think, his doctor, and they were kind of like, okay, whatever. And so then she took it to the press and it was published. So the army sealed all records of Dr. Barry for 100 years in response to this, and they only came open again in the 1960s.
Lord.
In 2017, I thought this was interesting. I found this while researching. His grave received a marker as part of a push to include more sites relevant to LGBT history in Britain.
Took him long enough.
Yeah, right? But people have continued to misgender him, even up to a couple of years ago when someone was writing a novel based on his life, referring to him with female pronouns. And what's interesting about this case is, as opposed to some of those other ones, scholars really do tend to talk about him with male pronouns as a man, which is why that's what I've done, today and in my research and my notes. Because this seems to be an example that a lot of scholars really do believe is someone who was a trans man, particularly because he lived with this identity for 56 years. It wasn't and there's no real evidence of him ever coming out of that identity, like in the way that we see in the film or anything. So it's a really interesting figure. I would love to see a film made about James Barry that actually, sort of properly dealt with that. And I think that would be such a fascinating topic for a film. So, movie people, if anyone's listening, I would love to see that done.
Yes.
And I particularly, would love to see not only a trans actor play James Barry, but I'd love to see trans people involved in, the writing and the creative team of it.
Seriously. Yeah. It's just, I would love to see more films that are not fictionalized messes about very important life experiences of people. And, to close out the episode, I have a very easy topic now. The costuming. The costuming was designed by Pierre-Yves Guéroud, who also did the costuming for The Three Musketeers, which we've already discussed.
Oh, no.
And he also did the costuming for The Bourne Identity with Matt Damon.
I knew it was coming. Oh, the way you can work Matt Damon into everything just continues to amaze me.
I remember when we were planning this podcast, I was like, every podcast has a bit. What is our bit going to be? Who knew our bit was going to be Matt Damon?
Who knew? I could never have guessed that our period drama podcast, that our bit would be Matt Damon and my, absolute... to say I hate him feels honestly too strong. I don't hate him. I just don't like him, but it's become such a thing that,
Mark my words, I'm going to make you watch The Brothers Grimm.
Oh, God. Sure.
And you can't say anything bad about it because Heath Ledger's in it and we can't speak ill of the dead.
No, I can say bad things about Matt Damon while still praising Heath Ledger. Don't you doubt me, Maggie.
I'm going to put that on the list right now.
You know what? I've got the list. I'll add it in.
There you go. It's actually a decent movie.
I will prove I'm a woman of my word.
It's not. I haven't watched it since it came out, and I got it on pay-per-view back when DirecTV had pay-per-view. It might still have pay-per-view. But I watched it 10 times.
Is this going to be in whenever we watched The Three Musketeers and I hadn't seen it for years whenever I suggested it and then was oh, it's worse than I remember.
Oh, I'm sure. I've looked up clips of it on YouTube and I'm like, oh, this was bad, but it was so good to be bad. But speaking of Three Musketeers, I'm super excited to say that this film actually had really good costumes. So I was nervous when I looked it up and I saw that Guéroud had did the costumes because I, of course, was not a huge fan of some of the choices that he made in his fantasy films. But he found a lot of his inspiration from Kenyon and Mitchell films, which were two cinematographers who shot crowds in Ireland, Scotland, and in England from the end of the 19th century up until around 1905. So he at least had historically accurate source material to go to. He also collected authentic Victorian fabrics from antique markets and art dealers throughout Paris and London before he arrived in Dublin to organize the workshop. I found a quote where he said that my focus was to strive for maximum authenticity and to give a secondhand look, even with the new pieces we made. He went on to talk about that at their first fitting, Glenn Close, who of course produced and co-wrote the film, looked at a pair of shoes that were too large for her and she put them on and said, "That's Albert's shoes." Guéroud goes on to say that she asked him to make these shoes heavier. And so that, after she started walking, she felt like she had finally captured Albert's stride, which knowing that after watching the film, it did seem like he walked with his feet very weighed down, which is definitely a choice that was made. But, I get that, actors are very much, they need certain things to help them feel whatever movement or body characteristics that they're trying to kind of show through the character. So I thought that was interesting just from that standpoint. But, overall, I, despite some of my qualms with Guéroud's past costume endeavors, this piece had very nice pieces. Everybody looked historically accurate. It was true to the period, true to the social standings for the different characters and their positions in the social class and also the locations. Everything felt very authentic. I tried to see if I recognized any pieces and I didn't. So I feel like most of these pieces were made for this film, or were from the very back depths of costume, warehouses. They weren't any recognizable pieces from other films.
Yeah, I have to say, of all my issues with the film, the costumes are not one of them. So,
Mm-mm. And I saw a couple of reviewers who said that Albert's clothing reminded them of Sherlock Holmes, and I was like, very much like the old-fashioned Sherlock Holmes,
yeah.
the spinster look.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I hope that we've done, some justice, not to the film. There's
no justice.
There's no justice here. To the topic. Yeah, if you've not seen this film, don't bother, honestly. Honestly. There are much better films out there to watch. It's honestly not even worth watching. Like, even if you're a Glenn Close stan, like, honestly, save yourself. Don't see it. I do think it's her worst performance, and I'm absolutely boggled by what made this her passion project. But the real thing here is that I would love to see more films that, do show sort of non-traditional takes on gender identity, that are made by people who know what they're talking about, and that are
Yes.
more authentic than this one is.
I agree. And before we close it out, this just came to me. If you would like to do something, I still have a fundraiser penned on my profile on Twitter that benefits the Transgender Law Center. If you are feeling so inclined, you can head over to my Twitter and go on there and give a donation. It would be really cool if for my birthday everyone would give either $3 or $7, because those are my lucky numbers. But I felt like it was something that is definitely fitting given this topic and this film.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for listening to our 21st episode of Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies.
We'd love to hear from you over on social media and to hear what you think of Albert Nobbs.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and over on the Earglue Media website, and of course, Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating over on Apple Podcast or on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading your review, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe and healthy.
And get vaccinated!
Woo!
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. Another episode as we continue to look at film. Wow, no. Trying again.
Oh no.